Hello, Waswere here, back with another video, and today we're looking at Mod Ryan's new combat beta that is hopefully coming soon, and the potential changes that we may see to the current styles in the game. For those of you that are unaware, Mod Ryan wants to put together a beta porting over the Necromancy, Critical, and Hit Cap changes over to the other three styles of Melee, Magic, and Range. This means that Criticals now provide bonus damage instead of just being high roll hits, and all hits regardless of criticals can reach up to 30,000 damage. Currently, the hit caps are 10,000 for non-crits and 12,000 for criticals, though that can be increased to 15,000 by Grimoire and then past 15,000 by Smoke Cloud and the Lang special effect. Before we get into any of the actual damage math, I want to give an example, and the best example is the basic ability Sacrifice, as it has a normal damage range of 20 to 100, making it very easy to calculate things on a rough basis. I won't be having any perks or damage buffs here just to keep it simple. Those will come in for the actual abilities later on. And let's also just assume a rough 35% critical chance, 30% from your gear like Grimoire, Biting, Reaver's Ring, Calgarian Demon, all that sort of stuff. And then the final 5% is from natural rolling criticals. Sacrifice normally hits between 21 and 100, and 65% of the time that will not crit, and it will roll between 20 and 95. It can't roll between 95 and 100 for non-crits due to that's where the naturally rolling crits are, and those hits are going to average 57.5. Then on the 35% chance of criticals, those will average 97.5%, as that's halfway between the minimum critical hit of 95 and the maximum critical hit of 100. Bring it all together and combining them, you end up with 71.5% ability damage per use of Sacrifice. Now if we port it over to the new system, 65% of the time the ability will roll between 20 and 100 and deal an average of 60%. And then 35% of the time the ability will roll 1.75 times as much, so that'll be between 35 to 175% ability damage, which would be an average of 102.5%. Again, you combine them all together with the relative weights for their chance, and that is 75.9% average damage, a substantial increase over the old method. Some notable takeaways from that example are that the Necromancy method leads to higher average damage. There's going to be higher maximum hits and lower lows on criticals, but the overall damage will be higher, which means there's going to be considerably higher variance on critical hits and your overall rotation of damage. Now for the actual math portion, I wanted to list out my assumptions beforehand, because we don't necessarily know exactly how Mod Ryan's beta is going to work, so I have to take some guesses on how he's going to do it. I assume that naturally rolling crits are going to work the exact same way under the new system. It's a pretty convoluted system, but essentially the tighter a damage range is, the higher chance that the ability critically hits naturally. For example, the first hit of Snapshot has a base damage range of 100 to 120, and it has a 33% chance to naturally roll a critical, while a standard ability where the minimum hit is 20% of the maximum hit, like our Sacrifice example, it's right around 5%. The technicality on how this works is it has to do with how those damage ranges interact with Precise and Equilibrium. I assume that at maximum level, the critical buff would be 75% to match 120 Necromancy. However, they could lower this amount to be more balanced, say 65%, as that's the amount of critical you get at level 100 Necromancy. And max gear is used unless otherwise specified, with a Calgarian Demon using scrolls, and the target is both vulned and smoke clouded. Alright, let's jump into Melee. I'm going to leave a link to the images used in this video in the description, if you want to look at all the abilities without me talking. But if you want to hear what I have to say, let's talk about a couple specific abilities. For the max gear perspective, there's no changes for max gear. However, I did want to mention that the ring I'm using is the Reaver's Ring, and I assumed no Lang spec was used for the live numbers. Havoc, Smash, and Sever, and the individual hits of Greater Flurry all do the same amount of damage. Currently in the live game, they deal an average of 4,000, and under these new scenarios, they will deal an average of about 4.6k. This is an increase of 13.2%. This 13% number is going to be very common, as it's essentially the DPS increase for a standard 20 to 100 ability that have no issues with hit caps. We see the same 13% increase for the Decimate, Cleave, Sever, and the individual hits of Destroy grouping, as well with Barge, the flanking stuns, and Assault. Hurricane is the first non-standard ability, as its second hit has a damage range of 84 to 161, and this tighter damage range means the new method of combat will increase this ability by more. Essentially, how you can logically think about it is critical increases the damage by less in the current system if the ability has a higher minimum, while regardless of how low or high the minimums are in the new system, it'll provide the same bonus damage. Declaw's EOF is another non-standard ability, as the total minimum hit is 31% of the maximum hit, which is why it gets a slight increase over that 13% number. For both Overpower and Meteor Strike, hit caps start to come into play. Overpower will pretty much always hit a 10k if you do not critical, dragging the average down to 11.5k. But once you put it in the new system, it not only gets the base damage buff, that 13% we're talking about, but hit caps are not an issue at all anymore, leading to a total 47% increase to its average damage. Meteor Strike is very similar, but not as much of a damage increase as the damage range is slightly lower, meaning there is less hit caps, but it still leads to a 33% increase. That is melee without Zerk. What happens when we Zerk and start dealing double damage? The Havoc group of abilities still aren't running into hit cap issues, as even crits only max out at 9.8k. However, the Decimate group of abilities are starting to see some hit cap issues, as there is a very rare chance for a non-crit 10k hit. This leads to a very tiny increase in comparison to the non-Zerk, up to 13.3%. Barge has more hit cap issues, as it ranges from 4.5k to 13.8k, meaning there is a ton of room for non-crit 10ks. I know I've had a few of those barges. This makes the average increase on Barge 15.8%. Flanking is the first time we've seen some major hit cap issues. A threshold flank can run between 6.3k to 19.4k, meaning that there are a lot of 10k non-crits, and even if you do crit, you're likely going to be hard capped at 15.7k. In fact, Deep Flank hits so hard that a maximum critical roll will reach the 30k hit cap, and that is the first ability we've looked at that does that. All in all, a 39% increase, and it might be enough that Deep Flank could be part of melee rotations again. Basic Flank also runs into hit cap issues, but not as much, leading to a 20% increase. Pretty much every ability runs into hit cap issues to varying degrees, leading to between 15 to 25% extra damage, but the real crazy part is that both Overpower and Meteor Strike nearly double their damage, with 89% damage increase and averaging well over 20k damage. For Overpower, that's 2 hits with the Zut Cape, so that would be 46.5k average damage from one singular ability. That's just insane. So, that's all the melee abilities. What's the takeaway? All abilities get a minimum of 13% increase to damage. Hurricane becomes a lot stronger as it has a tight damage range. Melee will still reach the hit caps of 30k when the big abilities crit, but on non-crits they will not be an issue anymore, greatly increasing melee's damage potential. Overpower becomes incredibly strong in Zerk and is no longer a 10k simulator. Chaos Roar is something I didn't touch on here, but it doubles the damage of your next ability. You can basically use this with anything that doesn't crit over 15k consistently. Like, I wouldn't use Chaos Roar onto Overpower, but Chaos Roar into Hurricane might see a lot more play now. Also, there is the EZK special, could now be even better, especially with the bleed hit cap being well over 10k, but I wasn't smart enough to do the math on it, so I didn't include it in this scenario. Ranged is the next style I'm looking at, and the only change I've made to gear is I replaced the Reaver's Ring with the Stalker's Ring, as I feel it's better than the Reaver's Ring most of the time. This brings the force crit rate down to 30.8%. I kind of alluded to this in the intro, but Range has a ton of tight damage ranging abilities, meaning it's going to get a lot out of this bonus crit damage. Needle Strike and Dazing start off similar as how we did with Melee, standard 20 to 100 ability, and the difference with this style is 14% for them. Greater Ricochet gets 14% as well. It's slightly more, as there is some tightening of the damage ranges on the 4th to 7th arrow of Gricko, but it's so minor that it makes a small difference. The new piercing shot deals 2 shots of 35 to 55% ability damage, and that is an incredibly tight damage range, as the minimum hit is 64% of the maximum hit. This leads to nearly 27% increase in damage, and its average damage and multiple hits makes it one of the better basics out there for range now. Snipe is another tight damage range ability, but not as extreme as piercing shot, with the damage range being 125 to 219%, but still an extra 25% damage on an already damaging ability. Shadow Tendrils will be interesting because it always criticals, no matter what it rolls, meaning that under the new system, it may always get the 75% damage buff. If so, the average damage would go to 17.1k, an 81% damage increase. If it only gets the buff when it rolls the critical, then it will still be a modest 41% increase. Also, unsure if you will take increased damage on critical. Snapshot has 2 hits, and I already mentioned the first one having a tight damage range of 100 to 120, but the second one also has a slightly tight range of 100 to 210, making the overall ability 23% higher. I should note that there is some fuckery with this ability, and the minimum hit of the second arrow is what you roll on the first arrow, so its damage range is slightly tighter than the math suggests, which means the beta should have a larger impact than the 23% I've calculated here. Incendiary Shot is the first hit cap ability we've ran into. It deals between 8.9k and 11.9k, meaning there will be some 10k non-crit hits. This leads to a 24% ability damage increase. And both the Last Guardian bow spec and the Dark Bow EOF have similar hit cap issues, leading to 23 and 21% increase respectively. Now let's Death Swiftness and see what happens. And honestly, it's mostly the same except for the damage increase lets more abilities reach hit cap, and the ones that reached hit cap earlier before and now are increased even more. Notably, the Last Guardian spec can reach the maximum of 30,000, and the Dark Bow can max out at 55k. So what are the key takeaways for ranged? Range has a very tight damage range, meaning that the critical change will have a large impact on the style. The bulk of its abilities do not interact with the hit cap, as it's really only Dark Bow, Incendiary Shot, and Bulk Spec that can reach it currently. I didn't talk about them yet, but Ruby Bolts have the potential to be insane. If they suddenly start hitting 30k instead of 15k, their effectiveness has more than doubled. Imagine an SGB spec with Ruby Bolts that could be 150k damage in one ability. And last, and maybe least, it's probably going to be least, is Magic. Magic is an interesting style because it almost exclusively never reaches the hit cap, and the majority of abilities are standard abilities, so this will be an interesting look, but I'm not hopeful. For this one, I went back to the Reaver's Ring, so the force crit rate is back up to 31.8%. Greater Concentrated Blast is the bulk of Magic's basic damage, and it gets a 13% DPS increase, which is what we expected based on the previous styles. And it is an already strong ability, so that 13% is nothing to scoff at, but it would have been nice to get a little bit higher. The various rack abilities all have a similar increase, but I've shown the base rack here for comparison's sake. Dragon's Breath and both flanks run 15% increase, and Detonate is the first ability that has some hit cap issues, as a fully charged Detonate can hit 10k non-crits, a lot, leading to 18% more damage in the new system. Smoke Tendrils has the same interesting dilemma that Shadow Tendrils had. Because it's a force crit all the time, does the 75% damage bonus apply on each hit? If so, the damage increase is 53%. Otherwise, it's only 11.5%, one of the lowest increases we've seen yet. The ultimates have tighter damage ranges, with Omnipower getting 24% extra damage and Tsunami getting 30% extra damage. It should be noted that G-Staff can reach the hit cap, but the damage loss to that is minor, but it's still 23% more. The thresholds of Wild Magic and Asphyxiate are not that special and have the same modest increase that the other basics have of 15%. And the last magic ability we're looking at is the Storm of Armadyl critical hit proc, which has a tighter range, so it gets 21% extra damage. With Sunshine being only 50% extra damage, there is less hit cap issues than with melee, but some abilities can hit it. Notably the Deep Flank, which is now 18%, and Tsunami being one ability that will see major changes with the Sunshine damage boost, giving a total of 30% extra damage. Mage as a whole has less hit cap issues because Smoke Cloud has 100% effectiveness with Mage, meaning with Grimoire the hit cap is up to 16.8k, and it's very hard for any magic ability to hit over 16.8k. So what are the takeaways on magic? Well, it's kind of meh in comparison with the other styles. Range and melee feel like they're getting a much better boost, just how the style works out. But it will still get a damage boost of probably somewhere in the 13 to 20% range for a full rotation, if the changes go through as I've assumed. The bulk of its damage comes from low, consistent hits, and hit caps are rarely ever a thing for magic. So it's only getting half the benefit of these changes. So I've gone through all three styles, and what's my conclusion after all this math? Well, melee is going to be the king of burst damage now. Any place where you need a burst and have some setup time, say Virago or Solak, it's going to be insanely good. Like, I'm looking forward to people doing Virago, and they're just going to get through P3, and it's going to die. Range will get the most overall buff over like a long sustained period. You won't need to play differently, and you will see a massive increase in your DPS. Reboot Bolts potentially come back into the meta, at least for SGB, if not for Gricko, to get those 30k hits. Magic is going to get a buff, but a small buff in comparison with the other two styles. It will probably feel bad to use with melee, range, and necro all having cool, big damaging abilities, and all Magic has is a nerf Staff of Armadyl and greater concentrated blast. My assumptions here were for maximum increase. If you suddenly say they cap the increase at 65%, which is the same as 99 at Necromancy, and assume that naturally rolling crits disappear, then those standard 13% increases that we're talking about earlier drops to 7%. It's still a sizable increase, but not as big. In that case, hit caps will be the bigger determination of a buff. Also, I'm still getting into how to do perfect ability damage calculations, going through all the steps correctly. So I may have made a calculation error here, but I think the general sentiment and the general scale that I came up with is going to be correct. I may have just calculated precise or equilibrium in the wrong order. Overall, I think this is a long overdue change. Hit caps suck when they're constantly being hit, and it should feel good to hit that cap, not feel bad to hit it like I currently do when I get that 10k non-crit hit with Barge. I'm hoping that the beta is going to be sick and that I'll get to try it at some point this month. But past that, have a good day, and I'll catch you in the next one.